r/AskReddit. Teachers, what was hilarious at the time that you absolutely 100% could not laugh at? The time a fourth grader asked me to show him my dong. Loudly. In front of his entire class. I'm a music teacher. And a female. He meant he wanted to see a gong. One child called another little hot dog and the victim was utterly distraught. I somehow managed to convince him I was crying because it's such a mean thing to call someone. My first year teaching, I was going over the parts of a parabola. So I had my boring old parabola up and I drew a dot at the vertex. Some kid goes, "That is the easy one to remember, it's the nipple of the titty." I had to keep facing the board for a bit, so pushed back the smile. We were playing a phonics game. There were 2 teams, one person from each team had to say a rhyming word of the word that I said. I said pick, a student said dick. I'm thankful the rest of the class didn't know what that was. Field trip instructor. I was leading a discussion on food chains with some 4th graders and asked what we call animals that only eat plants. The answer I got was virgins. Edit, I heard a lot of funny things in that job. The other funniest one was when I was going over cardinal directions with 2nd graders. I had them all chanting never eat soggy waffles or sour worms or whatever they like to say, and just as they all quiet down one of them says never eat Santa's wife. That was the only time in 7 years working with kids that I completely lost it in front of a classroom, children, teachers and parents. It took me about 30 seconds to regain composure, and even then I kept cracking up through the rest of the lesson. The kids thought it was funny because it was silly, the parents knew why I really thought it was so funny. A 1st grade boy called me Toots. I had a kid who got extremely angry because I told him that he couldn't do something, don't remember what. He started stomping and screaming and became so angry that he dropped his pants and stood there in his underwear glaring at me. I wanted to laugh so bad, but it would have just pissed him off more and that would not have helped the situation. 5-year-old starts randomly bawling. Quite concerned, I rush over and ask what's wrong. She holds up a single hair and says her hair is falling out and she's going bald. I had to explain that hair falls out naturally but new hair takes its place. I'm a history teacher. We were looking in the textbook at a section on the Founding Fathers. Several of them had their own subheadings and a little paragraph about them. Like this. George Washington, 1732 to 1799. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826. Benjamin Franklin, 1707 to 1790. I then have a student raise their hand and ask, completely serious, if you call these numbers, do they still work? She thought their birth and death dates were their phone numbers. I teach high school, the class lost their shit, and it took everything in me to keep a straight face. 5th grader told me he wanted to be a doctor when he grew up so he could make babies. I changed the subject. I taught at an inner-city high school under an extremely unpleasant principal. He was petty, unbelievably rude, and unprofessional to students and teachers alike. He would literally yell at teachers, often over simple misunderstandings. After 1 year of working with him, he and his wife went through a foreclosure on their McMansion that was published in the local newspaper. Since faculty and staff all hated him, we smugly gossiped to each other about it, but obviously never said anything to him. The same week the foreclosure was published, a big fight between 2 students broke out in the cafeteria during my lunch duty. The principal helped break it up, then screamed at the student who started the fight in front of everyone in the cafeteria, "That's it. You're expelled. I'm throwing you out." The student snapped back, "You ain't doing shit. You can't even pay the note on your house." I currently work at a pretty rough Title I school. Our principal is also universally hated. He was an administrator when I attended the high school some years ago and he was hated then, too. Earlier this year, some of my students showed me a meme that had been airdropped to the entire cafeteria. It was our male principal. Photoshopped. With weave, nails, lashes, and Bratz doll lips. The text read, "Take them hoods off, occur." The next day, some kids had printed it out and hung it up all around the school. The kids have also taken to calling him Skeletor to his face, which, honestly, is an incredibly apt nickname that my classmates and I also used for him all those years ago. I try really hard not to laugh, but I'm kind of proud of them. I used to teach English to Korean kids. They had to do some writing and one wrote about their pet cat. The family called it Pussy. The whole piece was about how much his dad likes pussy. When I taught 1st grade, kid number 1 says kid number 2 said the B word. I inquired what was the B word? Kid number 1 says vagina. Had to clench my teeth together to keep from laughing. Had a child wandering round the classroom holding something to his chest, all the children were laughing. Asked him to turn around. He had a piece of paper with 2 nipples drawn in and was holding it to his chest like they were his actual nipples. That took a lot of restraint not to laugh out loud at, but I gave him the usual speech of it not being appropriate. The next day he did the exact same thing with a drawing of a belly button instead. That time I did laugh. I was helping a 3rd grader who didn't want to work on his subtraction of 3-digit numbers that required borrowing. I told him, fine. Never learned to do this. Then I'm going to open a store that sells things you absolutely love, and when you give me your money, I'll just randomly hand you back change that is less than you should actually get because you can't do the math to figure it out, so I'll just take all your money. He looked at me dead in the eyes for a few seconds before stating, that's bullshit. I had to hold back laughter for about a good 20 seconds before I could reply, you're right, so learn to do addition and subtraction and you won't have to worry about it. Kids were on laptops and one group was talking about Life of Brian and of course Biggest Dickus. Kid 1 Google it, it's really funny. Kid 2 but won't it be rude? Kid 1 no, it's old and funny and no swearing so it's fine. A few seconds later Mannix screaming from Kid 2. He had instead Googled Big Dick. We all had a good laugh at his misfortune in the staff room. Also taught special ed. A boy walked out to the hall to get a drink. The principal, who was an obese woman, walked by and said hello Adam. He said hello and he was the type of kid who tried really hard to make conversation and he innocently said that's a nice dress you have on. It is a really big dress. How did you find such a big dress? She never skipped a beat and with a huge smile said well Adam it isn't easy finding such big dresses. Same kid one day was upset to get to school and his instructional assistant was absent. They explained to him that her mother had died and she had to travel to the funeral, but would be back next week. He said he was sad. She comes back and again he was trying to make conversation and he said, how is your mother? She's still dead? I used to teach 3rd graders, non-native English, and one time one of them ran up to me to tattle on his classmate and said, Teacher, Tunwa just said duck you, so Tunwa, who was running behind him goes. No teacher, no. I only said duck I didn't say looks around and starts to whisper. You. I was like, no. That's not the bad word, it's the other one, but I was dying, I had to turn around and go laugh behind a corner. We were doing a lab testing density of objects, including wooden, rubber, and styrofoam balls. In the middle of class a student loudly yells out, stop touching my balls. I legitimately couldn't breathe for a minute. Don't know how my teacher kept a straight face on this to be honest. History teacher would always say let's get quizzical when we had a quiz. One day we had a test so my friend raised his hand, oh Mr. M don't you mean let's get testicle? Teacher just said you can do that on your own time. Brian as our 8th grade class lost our minds. Sounds like Mr. B. Same Mr. B taught American history for 7th grade I think. Anyways one day he was talking about how if you all do good on the test we will have a movie day, maybe we can watch Last of the Mohicans. Without skipping a beat, kid named Brent asked but we never watched the beginning did we? I asked my kindergartners if anyone knew what a period was, while teaching sentence punctuation, and one boy enthusiastically says yeah, my mom has them in the bathroom. Oh man, I was the kid and it was like 18 years ago and I still cringe/laugh at myself. We had to pick stories to read out loud in front of the class, and I picked this cute one about candy strippers. You know, volunteers for hospitals. My dumb kid ass kept reading out loud multiple times and when I grow older, I want to be a candy stripper. I can still hear my teacher wheezing with a red face in the back of the classroom. For the life of me at the time, I could not figure out why she kept laughing. But as an adult it kills me. Not a teacher, but a bus driver. I recently had a kindergarten student who was rubbing his eyes like crazy, and definitely had something in there. He looked super uncomfortable so I took a look at it instead of sending him off to the nurse immediately. Turns out his fuzzy black gloves were shedding as he was rubbing his eyes. When I came back his gloves had shed enough fuzz that he looked like he was wearing a Batman mask. I used an eye wash kit to clean him up real quick and told him to stop rubbing his eyes, and help him take his gloves off, because that's what was irritating his eyes so bad. Cut to unloading at school, he's walking past me, sobbing, gloves on, eyes fuzzy. He looks up at me with fuzzy eyeballs and says, I think you were right about the gloves, my parents say bus drivers are dumb, but you were right this time. In a freshman history class you hear a lot of cursing. I usually let it go but if I heard duck too loudly I would call them out and make them give me another word instead. This kid looked at me totally panicked for several seconds before loudly blurting out biscuits. The whole class got a kick out of it, and the rest of the year they used the word biscuits in place of various curse words. They got very creative. I have a girl whose mom died when she was very little. She brings it up often, and I always try to be supportive of her and her pain. It is valid. And it's freaking sad. However, there's another girl in my class who is friends with her. And every so often Susie will say my mom's dead in this very factual way, and I'll hear Lori just sigh, "Oh Jesus," and every single time that happens I physically have to not laugh out loud. Like clamp my mouth shut. Lucky I wear a mask because the exhausted way in which she says that is just goddamn hilarious. Had a kid once ask me if I'd traveled a lot. Yes, Phoebe, I have. Have you ever been to Niagara Falls? Phoebe was 15 at the time. She never lived it down. God, I hope she reads this. Every time I was in trouble, my nervous reaction is to start laughing. You know that random thought in your head going, this is a terrible time to start laughing. So here I got scolded by a teacher for forgetting to do my homework. My brain tells me not to laugh. Hicklethum laughs. I don't know why. That naturally didn't help the situation. Teacher is obviously not impressed. Takes me to the principal's office. So the principal gets angry at me for laughing in his face despite my apologies. Calls in my parents to talk about my behavior. My mom pitches up, and as soon as the guy starts telling her about me not having respect for them, she gets nervous and starts laughing at him. I'm sitting in the corner quiet as a mouse, just thinking of how awkward my life was going to be from now on. Luckily we moved the next year and I got to change schools. I was told just the other week, "Miss Teacher, we don't have time for this." In a totally earnest voice. By a 2-year-old. This was me washing my hands before I served her breakfast. 2 8-year-olds got into a tiff. Kid number 1 got mad at kid number 2. In typical 8-year-old fashion, kid number 1 told kid number 2, "I'm not your friend anymore and you're not invited to any more of my birthday parties." Kid number 2 responded, "I only went to your party for the cake." During my training year, I was hearing a girl read, and she was reading The Curious Incident, and when she came across the word duck really quietly said to me, "I know that's a word I shouldn't say," and skipped over it. She kept on reading, confidently heading straight on to the next page, and basically shouted the word cunt out in complete innocent bliss. A bee flew into the classroom during student presentations. One guy grabbed his textbook and squashed the bee, somewhat overdramatically. The next student's presentation, saving the bees. Not a teacher, but a kid in one of my old classes asked the teacher during biology, "If I'm a mammal, and bats are mammals, could I have bat children?" I had instructed my college students to use Word to do some free writing, no prompt, you're just supposed to record your thoughts. After struggling a bit, one student blurted out, "This is just a blank page. Where are the instructions?" First grader wrote, "I want to be an astronaut because you get to sit upside down." Reading a novel with about 30 or so 15-year-old boys. The novel's characters live in holes in the ground. Some characters are trying to visit another, but he's not at home in his little burrow thing, and they debate entering his home without his knowledge. This led to me reading the following line of dialogue aloud. "You don't just come into another boy's hole without asking permission first." I mean, I was an instructor in the army, I don't know if that counts, but one of the privates I had in my class had the last name Shart. God damn, it was so hard to keep it together at times. Teacher hears a girl's phone vibrating in her purse and says, "I hope that is a phone." Teacher walks another 2 steps and realizes what she just said. Class erupts in laughter. Drew a rushed map of Florida, USA on the board with little circles as the islands coming off the peninsula. Principal was taking regional director on a tour of the school and popped into my room. They stood silent staring at the board. I said, "Hi, welcome. We are just talking about Florida and the Bahamas." Turned around and realized it looked like a massive ejaculating penis. My teacher aide had tears trying to stifle her laughter. I was the student. My parents called films for adults adult movies because English is their second language. I wrote adult movies on a gift list for Father's Day when I was 7. The teacher made me change it to movies for grown-ups and suppressed her laughter, but the 4th and 5th graders didn't hold back. Standing in the school hall as the local vicar did an assembly. Quite a large kid sat nearby. At the end of the assembly, vicar asks children to bow heads for Lord's Prayer. Big kid bends forward and lets rip the loudest and longest fart I ever heard. Kid directly behind it leaned forward too and screams, "Ugh." It went right in my face. And starts to cry. 300 kids start laughing. Most teachers trying to settle them down. I was laughing so much I had to go outside. Tears streaming. I couldn't go back in because the whole thing to me was so funny and it happened so close to me. Not me, but a friend teaching pronouns using brother and sister. He asked the kid, "Do we use he or she for brother?" After a good while, the kid answered, "How am I supposed to know? I'm an only child." Not me but my wife. She had a special needs kid in her 5th grade class that had underdeveloped limbs. They showed a documentary about Chernobyl and they got to a part discussing the physical deformities caused by radiation. Another boy looks at the screen, then at the kid, then back to the screen, and according to my wife you could see the wheels turning in his head. He turns back to the kid and says, "Name, were you born in Chernobyl?" She knew it was incredibly mean and hurtful, but she had to suppress a laugh simply because of how it played out. My mom was a secretary at a public elementary school for many years and heard many things. One of my favorites was when the cafeteria was evidently serving some nasty-looking food one day. A young maybe 10-year-old boy went through the line, and when he finally got to the end he turned to the kid next to him and said, "I can't eat this f***ing shit." Student, Alaska is a state? Are you sure? It doesn't even touch the states. Me, yes, I'm sure. Student, I need to look this up to be sure. Me, you really don't, but go ahead. Student 2, wait, states don't have to touch. Does that mean Hawaii is a state? Student 3, what about New Mexico? I teach high school. I am the kid. At daycare one summer we were having a face paint day. I had recently seen the movie My Girl. In it a dead woman is made up and prepare for her funeral viewing. At the funeral someone comments that the dead woman looks like a $5 hooker. I had no idea what that meant, but little kid me thought the dead looked pretty good for being dead. You can see where this is going. My turn for face paint comes up and the only male teacher asks what I want. I say a $5 hooker. I still remember his strangled what? And I knew I said something wrong and I quickly changed to a flower. Lord, I was so innocent. What a dummy. I was taking a picture with a first grader and my face was washed out from the fluorescent lights. I am white, and he said, "You too white, I can't see nothing." Not me but my mom had a student who constantly threw temper tantrums. He was in the 5th grade, stomping, crying, punching, whole shebang. Before you ask, had some mental issues but nothing that stopped his learning. Maybe autism? If I remember right? And he threatened my mom over a book. He then told her, "I'm gonna tell my mom on you," and she looked at him and said, "I'll tell my mom on you then too." He was so stunned he walked out of the room, book in hand, and sat outside the room for 5 minutes. After the 5 minutes, he opened the door and threw the book at her. She dodged it and he said, "My dad can beat up your dad," and then he stormed to the office. She still laughs about it. Made an account specifically to tell the story of the time this happened to me in reverse. I was in choir in middle school and our teacher was really picky about diction and pronunciation. So, one day in rehearsal, she's shouting advice at us as we sing, and apparently we're not singing the end of the word in clearly enough. We get to the and as we're coming up to the end, she shouts passionately, "I need more D. Give me more D." She had no clue why half the choir of middle schoolers was losing it. I was teaching 3rd grade general music at a private Catholic school and we were learning about call and response. I would say something like, "Put your hands on your head and do the gesture," then they would all respond and do the same. Eventually I pointed at kids and they took turns being the leader. Everything was going great until a kid yelled out, "Put your hands on your nuts." Not a teacher, but we were supposed to put unsure into a sentence for homework and I wrote, "My teacher is unsure if she is ugly or not." Mom was mortified. I still think it's funny. Not mine, but unforgettable for me. My US history teacher always planned for a 5-minute coffee break as soon as the Cape Horn slide had to come up. He'd just say it straight-faced knowing full well it sounds just like he just said gay porn to a room full of 16-year-olds. Just sat and sipped from the badass motherfucker mug that he held backwards because that made it totally unreadable. I offered a kid gushers, and he said, "No thanks miss, I don't like things that bust in my mouth." My mom, when doing guided reading with a group of kids, had one child read the sentence "hours of the night," but they pronounced hours like horse. I'm not a teacher, but one day we were learning about Great Britain. We live in Britain, by the way, and a boy raises his hand and asks, "Miss, have you ever gone to Britain?" The whole class starts busting out laughing, and I think the teacher even chuckled a bit, but she probably just held back her laughter. The guy couldn't figure out why we were laughing. Not a teacher, But when I was in the second grade, we had the chance of participating in Special Persons Day where we could invite our mom, dad, grandma, whoever our adult at home was. This came with a picture and a little sentence to describe it. Anyways, my parents are divorced and my dad had custody, but my stepdad still had a good role in my life. I drew a picture of them together holding hands, complete with hearts, and told everyone about how I love my two dads. My teacher asked my dad why she hadn't met his husband and cracked up when he explained it. We still have the picture to this day. White people smell like hot dog water when they sweat, said by a third grader when I commented about smells coming in from recess. I nearly wet myself trying to hold it together. I work with 4-year-olds. One time, a little boy's mom sent him this huge dill pickle in his lunch. Naturally, this was a huge deal for the other kids to see. I guess one of the kids tried to grab it off of him and he said, "Miss Tara, Johnny is trying to touch my pickle." I just about died. It was so funny. Not a teacher, but a couple months ago, 10th grade math, teacher's helping me and a friend, and my friend is on his phone looking at a basketball camp run by Nike. I said, "Why do all the good things have to be German?" "Well, some good things, some are bad." Teacher says, "What's bad that's German?" And I said, "Well, for starters, the Holocaust was pretty bad." My friend broke out laughing and my teacher just said, "I thought it was going to be Birkenstocks and socks." Not a teacher, but my teacher handled this like a pro. We had to give PowerPoint presentations in front of the class. One kid clearly plagiarized, but she couldn't really prove it, so let it continue for the time being. That is, until he got halfway through his presentation. He had clearly copy/pasted without even bothering to read it, because suddenly the sentence "this was especially useful during my years of teaching in the 1970s" was spotted towards the end of one slide. Several people giggled. But he didn't notice. He actually read that line out. Realized what he'd done. Looked at the teacher. She responded with one word. Continue. "Oh, Charlie, you were a bad kid, but we all loved you." I was the student. We were playing this little trivia game in a class I was in. And the question was, what are the 5 senses? They clearly got it right. So I sarcastically said, "That was hard," with a follow-up of, "That's what she said." You could clearly see the teacher almost burst, but she kept cool and told me it wasn't school appropriate. During a sex ed lesson, explaining differences between testosterone and estrogen, ultimately why teenage boys are more predisposed to dangerous behaviors, a student referred to testosterone as the brain prescribing boys a case of the riskies. I died. This same student also wrote a book of murder that looked like a precursor to Stick Death, I still have it, and was in general, a goofy-looking, unkempt, and absolutely original human being. Nobody could make me laugh like that kid. A first grader in the bathroom, bathrooms in the room, and I hear repeated flushes. I ask, "Are you okay in there?" Response, "Yeah. I like the feeling of the wind on my hiney." I was working with an 11-year-old who struggled with a math question. Trying to save face, she said, "I'm just doing math until my career in acting and modeling takes off." I teach first grade. Last year I had a student who had a lot of behavioral issues and emotional problems. We were working on it, but that boy would cry about anything. The school I teach at is in a rough area, so even though they are 6 to 7 years old, most don't act that young. Well, one day the student just goes on boo-boo crying, because he didn't have a yellow crayon. Like, "Honey, just ask me for one, or your neighbor?" But anyways, lol, all the kids are staring at him and I have stopped the lesson at this point because he's being so loud, and one kid just looks at him, then looks at me and goes, "Geez Louise. Not again." And dramatically threw his head down. It was so dramatic that the boy crying even stopped to look at him. It took all my energy just to not bust out laughing. But I knew if I did the boy would just start crying again, and he had stopped, so I just said, "Okay, well, looks like we can move on now," and just went on with things. Lol, I love my grade, but mad they are so dramatic sometimes. I used to teach overseas in a high school. English was not their first language. I had an 11-year-old girl come in with a t-shirt that said, "Women of the world unite and make your men sleep on the wet spot tonight." Not really funny, but I couldn't react in front of the whole class. She had no idea what the t-shirt said or meant. It was just cool to have English writing on her shirt. Theater teacher. 2 middle school girls were in place to perform a rehearsed scene, and they got into a real-life shouting match about something stupid. I let them vent off for a bit, before deciding to just let them get the scene over with. I yelled, "Action!" And they linked arms like best friends and began smiling and walking like they were besties. The entire class broke out into a laugh, as did I, And the girls instantly stopped and yelled at me, "You're not making this any easier." Subbing for a 4th or 5th grade class, I had handed some tests back to the kids. After class, one kid comes up and tries to bribe me to give him a better grade. With a whole $1. Not a teacher but a student. My friend says look at this and goes over to our other friend across the room. He puts a sticky note on his back without him feeling. The sticky note says small pp and then he put a second one next to it that says like really small. The boy we put the sticky notes on was one of my best friends and we all do football together, so it wasn't bullying. Everyone in my class sees the notes on his back and he has no idea what everyone is laughing about. Then the bell rings and our math teacher walks in. We have a test today, so he starts handing it out. He walks behind our friend and tries desperately hard to not laugh, even covering his face with the test papers. He discreetly takes the notes off and hands them to him. As soon as my friend read the notes, he immediately perked his head up and looked at me. The whole class died laughing in the middle of the test and our math teacher did as well. Least focused test of my life. There was this Chinese language teacher at this middle school that I was subbing at. English was not her first language and oftentimes her daughter would stay in her class to bridge the language gap. Well, one day the daughter wasn't there and the teacher cut her middle finger and was motioning that she had cut it and it hurt. Some of the 8th grade boys saw her raising her middle finger in distress and after bandaging it, told her that raising a middle finger meant good luck in the States. Furthermore, they told her that everyone had a test that day and could use some good luck. She promptly wished everyone good luck and during class change wished every student stumbling past her class the same gesture. I was at first in shock, but then having those kids in the next class period and hearing their improvised plan, I could not believe how quick-witted they were. Calling the principals to let them know the situation was the toughest phone call I've had to make. Kept replaying the fox and hound scene to keep from cracking. My 2 favorites. 2nd grader was taking a test and he was stressing about something silly. I walked over a few more times and said I was just checking in for moral support. Well, his neighbor heard all this and started dramatically doing the same things for my attention and looking over in my direction. Suspiciously, I checked in. "Hey, I noticed you looking over at me quite a bit, did you need something from me?" His reply sent me. "I just wanted more old support." A close second is a 4th grader asking me with tears in his eyes, if curly fries were pig's tails. My youngest son took a huge mouthful of his food, so I commented, "Dude, that's a huge mouthful." My older boy pipes up, "You're a huge mouthful." I couldn't let that one go, so I replied, "That's what your mom says." My son thought he was being funny when he came back with, "Because you are." Ha ha, the kid had no clue. I had to refrain from laughing, otherwise I would have had to explain. Just the other day. Teaching kids about homeostasis and asked them what your body does when it's cold. One of the boys shouted that your balls get sucked back up into your body. Tried not to laugh and had to yell at him that it was inappropriate. Not a teacher, this was me. In high school we were reading Macbeth and at one point in the story my English teacher asked the class who else has a healing touch. Everyone said Jesus. My dumbass said E.T. Not a teacher but a teacher's assistant, when one of our students asked if I had children. I say no, then the student asked why I didn't buy one. One of my students called another a turd sniffer. Yesterday, when a boy in my class finished last in a spelling bee and was understandably upset. A girl in the class who has some real problems, turns around to him and deadpan looks into his eyes and says, "You were a disappointment." Sounds mean, but I found it so harsh that inside I was laughing. My husband's story from teaching high school English. Early in his teaching career he had a student who had a prosthetic leg. She got up in front of the class one day to give a report. My husband noticed that the front row of students was giggling at her. He looked down and saw that her prosthesis somehow was turned backwards. There she stood with one foot facing the opposite direction from the other. She then proceeded to bang the foot and leg on the side of his desk to try and get it turned straight. The class, a bunch of 13-year-olds, erupted in laughter. It was all he could do not to laugh. He excused her so she could go to the bathroom to get it straightened out. I was talking about the recent passing of Stephen Hawking and his work, and a student of mine shouted, "Steve Aoki, DJ, died?" Obscurely the whole class laughed, but I had a hard time not to, and proceeded to explain who Stephen Hawking was. I taught high school for a bit. During some downtime or group assignment, a few students were chatting, and one girl said something that I think embarrassed another girl. In an obviously flustered, though not overly angry or sad, state, the other girl responded with a loud "suck my ass." I luckily was able to keep a straight face while everyone laughed in shock, And the girl clearly forgot her school filter for a moment. I took her out of the class to make sure she was okay and sent her for a 3 to 5 minute walk instead of sending her to the principal's office. I still laugh about that from time to time. Midway through telling off the whole class for being rowdy and disruptive. A kid with severe autism, sweetest kid you could ever meet, raises his hand, just goes, "Sir, can I feel your hair?" I was done. Summer camp counselor doing a get-to-know-you game where the kids came up with the questions. One asked, "If you were a cookie, who would you want to eat you?" I was a student in that time, but we had physics and the laws of kinetic energy. The teacher, about 50 years old, gave us homework on 2 moving balls. He said, "I have 2 balls. And one of them is hollow." The class erupted into laughter. The teacher realized what he said, but he was holding his laughter. I was the student. I was 16. We had to get in pairs but had an uneven number. I looked my history teacher dead in the eye and said, "Can we have a threesome?" I was a student when this happened, but a friend accidentally said octopuses have 8 testicles instead of 8 tentacles when reading in a science class. The teacher was having a very hard time holding back laughter. 11-year-old came out with "My mom's got a whip at home." Thing is though, she doesn't own a horse. I taught 8th grade gifted science. We were discussing the sensitivity of the balance. I wrote sensitivity on the board. Also, during a state scripted sex unit, I was required to write places where AIDS is found on the board. We would write blood, semen, etc. at lunch. A coworker snuck in and wrote Hoboken. Not a teacher but a school psych. Had a little girl in kindergarten in a counseling session. She tells me she's very afraid of the male, 35 years oldish, principal. I ask why. She says in her most sassy voice, "He's too handsome, his eyes are too blue and I can't look at him." Couldn't help but giggle to myself. I teach design and technology. I was teaching a GCSE class, 15 to 16-year-olds, about injection molding. One boy, who was very sweet and sheltered, asked me why the 2 parts of the mold were called male and female. I had to gently explain that the male mold goes inside the female mold. He went beetroot red. We had a good laugh about that in the staff room. When one of my kids tattled on the other, saying, said the B word. I proceeded to ask the student what word they said, thinking it was a bad one. It was but. I had to immediately turn around and laugh lol. Not sure how my teacher didn't laugh at this. In advanced biology, we were going over reproduction and anatomy. Some girl's hand shoots up, instantly yelling, "Saran wrap works right." Teacher pauses at the board, gripping the chalk tighter and says, "No, it's rather porous." The girl slowly put her arm down in horror. Not a teacher but once this one kid in our class decided it would be a good idea to throw his school bag over the railing. Teacher came in and he explained himself by saying my back was useless and some kid chortled at the back of the class, and when I knew you didn't have a spine. A little boy, preschool, kept getting up at lunch and was also standing on the bench seat. I kept telling him to sit down. The sweetest, most polite girl I've ever taught, slapped the table and yelled, "Sit your ass down." Well, he sat down and behaved after that. It was hilarious and I had to cover my mouth with my hand to keep from laughing. I'm an art teacher. A 4th grader was casually painting as I walked by his seat. We make eye contact and he says to me, "A gnome is racer, once you do black you can't go back." I just stared blankly at him for a moment and said, "What do you mean?" He held up his brush that he had been trying to clean in his paint water cup. "Once you do black your brush is too dark for other colors." When a kid said that the Red Baron was an ass pilot instead of ace pilot. Mine happened after my 7th graders watched Fern Gully. They started playing with the 90s slang. A little boy looked at me and was like, "Miss, you're bodacious." Oh my god, the look on his face when I had to calmly explain to him what that meant. He backpedaled so quickly. I was dying inside. I had to keep a straight face, otherwise this kid was facing the teasing of a lifetime from his classmates. I taught kindergarten for years and had a kid named Benny one year with a mild cognitive disability. He could still function fine in a regular classroom, but stood out enough that other kids treated him a little different. Everyone in the school knew Benny by reputation because he was often saying funny things and had an obsession with SpongeBob that defined his personality. They also recognized he was a bit different and gave him some extra grace. Benny was also twice the size of your average 5-year-old, making him stand out even more. Anyway, one week it was Benny's turn to be line leader, the most coveted job in kindergarten. He was thrilled. Day 1 went off without incident, but on day 2, Benny decided our line was now a train and started making train sounds as the class followed into the hallway, then bypassed the little stop sign at the intersection and kept moving around the corner into the next hall. I had been standing near the middle of the line and had to do a little jog to catch him. When I got up to him, he was moving quickly, still chugga-chugging. I urgently said, "Benny, stop or you'll lose your line leader job." Benny instantly threw his hands up in the most dramatic fashion and exclaimed, "Why do I need this job?" and ran to the back of the line. The older kids in the hallway all bust out laughing. It was the most absurd thing to hear from an oversized 5-year-old. I used to be a special education teacher. I had one student, high function, low social skill autism. He was cooking in our life skills class when he turns to me and his one-on-one ed tech and out of the blue says, "Chuck Norris can reproduce anal sexually." Turns back around and keeps cooking. He meant asexually. It was the funniest thing ever. His ed tech has to excuse himself and go laugh in the hallway. This was my first year teaching. I just asked him how his sushi rolling was going and we kept moving forward with the day. I'll never forget working with that student. He was such a delight. My student kept mistaking the word eunuch with unique and kept proclaiming that he was a eunuch boy. A student confused the word prostitutes and protesters. She read a little essay about how prostitutes were marching in the street and people were coming out to support them. She got a good grade. While I was working in a very urban area in a therapeutic day school, we had a speaker come in who was a very small Caucasian woman. One of my students, a sophomore, black, asked her, "Can you help us get bitches? And where yo lips at?" I had to walk out of the room. Teaching a furniture making class to high school kids and a female student asked for help installing a brass piano hinge on her hall bench/shoe organizer. I told her I'd be along in a minute and reminded her to do proper prep by drilling pilot holes and dip the soft brass screws in wax to reduce the chance of breaking the heads off the screws. To which she sighs loudly and proclaims I'm just not good at screwing. The class had a good laugh and so did I after class. I gave my online high school class an assignment that they had 2 weeks to complete. I described the assignment in a lecture and answered questions, and told them that if they had any further questions, they could email me. 2 weeks later, one student turns in their assignment where they had copy-pasted my study questions and topic examples, and under every single one written I sadly do not understand the question. I'm eternally thankful that it was an online class so nobody could see me wheezing. Was teaching a 5th grade unit on the general theme of rights and responsibilities. As our school likes to make everything connect up, we did some lessons on medical ethics. I concocted a lesson on the Tuskegee experiment, having taught the main points of medical ethics before. The idea was to identify how many ethical points the experiment violated. As it's 5th grade, we don't really get too much into the disease that the men suffered from was syphilis. One kid, whose confidence far outstripped his knowledge on most subjects, wouldn't let go of wanting to know what the disease was called. So eventually, I say that it was a disease called syphilis. "Oh yeah," he says. "I think my mom's had that." I just about popped a few rivets trying not to laugh. When a young boy claimed that woman is so pretty I want to marry her while pointing at the RuPaul Drag Race advert on the bus stop we were waiting at. Also, when a young girl in the park came running over distraught holding a chicken leg in her hand, the actual leg and claw, not a cooked chicken leg, I thought, well, this is a teaching opportunity, and explained the circle of life and how animals need to eat other animals to survive and feed their babies. This was when she chose to say, "But it's my pet chicken." Turns out her back garden was right behind the bushes in the park where she found said chicken leg. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and if you have your own funny teacher stories, leave them in the comments below.